How many, by show of hands, was this the first time you ever heard this parable? Look around. Not a single hand up. We're very familiar with this parable. The prodigal son. We've heard it 1,000,000 times, maybe some of us 2,000,000. But since our childhood, this is one of the stories that is told over and over again. And we know it. God is willing to forgive us in whatever state that we're in. Wherever we find ourselves, God still loves us enough to forgive us. Amen? All right, we'll see you guys next week. Thanks for coming. Right? As we know, parables are the way that Jesus teaches. And most of the time, a parable is supposed to be an illustration or a story, and then the author gives us the meaning. And I joked around saying I got dibs on the parable of the sower and the seed because that's one of the few that has an interpretation. Again, we find ourselves with a parable without an interpretation. So in this story, I'm going to introduce you to a few different people. I'm going to talk about them, and that way you guys can connect to their faces as I share their impact on this sermon. You guys ever know this guy here? Dr. Greg Carey, professor of New Testament at Lancaster Seminary. He has a little booklet that he uses on Luke, and he talks about these parables. And it was actually his quote that I just used, that the parables are used to teach. So he says that Jesus uses parables in his ministry. Over 40 of them occur in the Gospels, but he did so in a distinctive way. In ancient rhetoric, a parable was a story or image designed to compare one thing to another and then explain the comparison. Jesus would tell a story or describe a situation and then let his audience reflect on its significance. In the Gospels, only rarely does Jesus explain a parable. Here we are, the parable of the prodigal son. So, Amy Jo Levine, she is a professor at Vanderbilt School of Divinity, New Testament, a lot of work with the parables, with the Gospels, and she's Jewish. How does that make sense? But given her context, of course she's going to know Jesus' background way better than we do. She lives it. She lives like Jesus. But her take on this story gives it a different view. She says that parables share similarities, especially in this section because it's the 3 parables of the lost items, right? You have the lost sheep, which we spoke about last week, the lost coin, which we are going to skip, and then the prodigal son. And that's the pattern. She says that there's a very distinct pattern with these 3 stories. Something is lost. There's a tension and anxiety over this lost item. Then it's found. And then there's always a party. I mean, let's celebrate for finding lost money, right? But she also describes the differences of this last one. Instead of one item, there are 2 sons. One son leaves on his own, and then he returns. And then there's a celebration. But the parable continues. And here's another tension that is presented with the second son.